Hi, I'm Tayler and I'm an artist working on Treaty 1 territory here in Winnipeg. My practice mainly concerns themes of preservation and mortality, and this is expressed through mold making and plaster casting. In the past, I used to be a photographer, but my practice transitioned into purely sculptural. But this body of work is all photography that I made during my last year of my undergrad degree. So I made this body of work in the year 2020 to 2021, and it was my last year of my undergrad degree. And it was also during this time that the COVID pandemic was really ramping up, so a lot of us were experiencing isolation and staying home to protect ourselves and others, including myself. And I brought my studio into my living space. So a lot of these photographs are featuring items from my home space or also my own body parts as well, just because I was using what is around me. So even though I didn't intentionally make work about COVID, I think I was unconsciously making work about COVID because it was just the situation that everyone was experiencing. So a lot of these images are still lifes using domestic objects that I recontextualized through the photograph through either uncanny compositions or odd object pairings, and just trying to find something very unfamiliar in these familiar objects that we all kind of know and experience through our day-to-day lives. So this piece, Pillows, here is kind of the first time that I really started manipulating physically with the objects. I wanted to choose pillows as a subject because they're very familiar and they elicit feelings of relaxation and laziness and peacefulness. Also, the texture of the pillows as well is very soft and comforting. So I wanted to try and recontextualize the object by placing it with an object that is kind of the opposite of what pillows may elicit. So I chose a belt. A belt is very hard. It has a lot of symbols and signals in it that are quite opposite to what the pillows signify. So I tried to come up with a way to incorporate the two objects together in a way that was interesting and new. So I thought of cinching the pillows together. We don't really see pillows in this type of composition or use, so I thought that was really interesting. I also thought it kind of subverted the feelings of comfort into maybe a sense of danger or violence even. So I thought that was very interesting in comparison to the really nice natural light and soft textures of the mattress and the pillows in comparison to this hard belt and the action that it is performing on these pillows. So for gemstones, I was thinking about the same things of recontextualizing familiar objects, but instead of pairing the gemstones with another object, I wanted to see if I could recontextualize it in its own state just by physical manipulation or actually handling it and placing it in the photograph. So originally I just wanted actually separated peas in the photograph, but when I opened my freezer, it was all freezer burnt and stuck together and it looked like a rock basically. So what really recalled the gemstone type action or feeling of it was the ice that was holding the peas together. It reminded me of like amethyst crystals and how in science textbooks rocks are documented in a certain way that's very standardized. So I wanted to see if I can kind of emulate that, but with this object that we kind of all know and have all ate before, and present it in a way that doesn't really resemble how it would be normally presented. So the peas are all stuck together. Originally it was a horizontal shape, so I flipped it and made it a vertical shape. And was also thinking about elevating it. How can I elevate this very normal object into something that is art-like or maybe scientific as well? So I thought placing it on a napkin was a bit humorous as well because it's just a paper napkin, but maybe having it so that's protecting the rock from the actual surface. And wanted to also think about the textures of the piece, so the textures of the peas and the visual cues that the peas gave in comparison with the napkin, and a lot of us know what a napkin feels like. And then layer it on top of this carpet runner where it's kind of an unusual texture, but in combination of the two that we are familiar with, the peas and the napkin, what does the carpet runner texture elicit. So for all of these, it's really layered, and the recontextualization really comes within the placing of the object itself and how it is photographed in the scene. So for these two pieces, I was really focusing on digital manipulation and the processes that Photoshop can do. At this time, I think I was focusing a lot on digital processes because I didn't have access to the darkroom itself. I used to be kind of an analog photographer, but made the transition to digital when all the facilities were closed, so I was just trying to use what I could use at home. So for the glass one, I did a subtle editing just of copy and pasting in the Photoshop, and this one was one of the first photos I took, and so it was definitely an experimentation of kind of what I could do with what I have. So the orange is just under the glass, and I kind of almost wanted that to be a part of the digital editing itself with how the glass was warping the orange. And then in post, I did even more editing and added a little copy-paste section of the same image and layered it onto that. So I was really thinking about how digital processes can alter images or information that we're receiving, and also just how it can maybe elevate or kind of unelevate a photograph. A lot of times when we're photoshopping, we're trying to hide the fact that we photoshopped something, so I wanted to make it super obvious and use Photoshop as an actual way of making images within an image. And for this one, it was kind of the same process as well, where I was taking an image in my house. I began with just choosing an egg as a subject because I thought the texture of a yolk is really interesting, and having it fully intact kind of is also gross, and it elicits different feelings towards the texture of the yolk or the white. And putting it in a bag, this blown up bag, also made it interesting. You don't put eggs in grocery bags. So I thought that was also a bit funny and humorous as well. So it was the same process as the glass one, where I thought the bag was also doing a sort of editing on top of the egg, and then putting that into post, and then once again editing with it. This one I used the clone stamp tool, and I wanted to kind of make it really subtle so that you almost couldn't see the editing within it. So almost having 2 egg yolks, or 3 egg yolks, even though there's only 2 in there. And also clone stamping this corner could be a part of it in real life, but now we're kind of questioning if that is actually possible. So once again, thinking about what digital processes can do and making an image out of an image that already exists.
Well, my name's Glawson. I'm an artist that is living and working in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I've been incorporated or invited into being part of this, what I think is quite an amazing exhibition that Hannah G. Curated for the Buehler Gallery, and I just thought I'd say a few things about the work that I do and the work that's in here and how it fits in with my history and my practice. Well, I figured I'd start with this image just because I think it represents the early part of my career. This photograph of myself and my partner Doug is from a body of work called Family Album, which was the first exhibition I had in the early 1980s. And that work was largely comprised of what I ended up calling diaristic work that I've been doing as part of my practice steadily for the last 35 years, I would say. And what that involves largely is my personal private space, my family, my friends. That was sort of the parameters that this early work comprised of in terms of what I chose to explore. I do see myself as a photographer with a capital P, meaning the medium itself was something that was very important to me. And exploring the medium for what it was as much a part of my practice as what I photographed, I would say, as well. And I guess in a way this photograph kind of shows a lot of that, in that it's a personal photograph, in that it's a photograph of me and my partner, Doug Melnick, that I've lived with and we've been together now for over 40 years. And this photograph came when I was in the full flush of just developing my relationship with photography in the sense that, or as a professional artist anyway, in the sense that I would say my energies in my practice was probably evenly split between the medium of photography itself. It was something I fell in love with, and also, obviously, in photography, it's what you photograph as well that becomes part of what you do and what you make. And because of my personality and the way I live and work and move through the world, where I got my greatest inspiration had to do with my personal world. And in a way, the work that is in this exhibition spans almost over 20 years, probably 30 years of practice. And it specifically, I would say it specifically deals with what I would call the domestic or the private or the diaristic, in that I have worked, I have done other projects. Portraiture is a big part of what I was interested in as a photographer. And I've done a number of portrait projects that I think of as discrete projects separate from the kind of work that I think this represents. I think that's a bit ironic to say looking at it, because it does look like a rather formal portrait as opposed to a kind of diaristic snapshot kind of photograph that actually the majority of these photographs from this body of work, family album, were largely spontaneous images that were situational in the sense that I always carried my camera with me and I just reacted to whatever was going on in my immediate circumstances, which largely involved family gatherings, leisure time. There are a lot of images from this time period and over the course of the next 15 years that involved going to summer cottages, which is a very, I think it's quite a big subculture of Manitoba because of the geography here and access to many, many lakes, for Winnipeggers in particular. So there are a lot of images from this time period that involved that environment, my home environment, and basically that sort of world suited my personality in the sense that it's not only where I felt the most comfortable in terms of making photographs, but it was also the most inspiring in terms of my sense of freedom to react and respond to what was going on around me. And which ultimately, I guess, shaped me into being the kind of photographer that I ended up being and the kind of work that I ended up making. I just wanted to mention or show in particular a couple of shots from the early work, the family album series, just as I mentioned how what I was largely concerned with was reacting to spontaneous situations. The first image I showed was more of a stage portrait taken after I was planning that image and that sort of thing. But this one, I would say, is probably a really good example of a couple of things. That spontaneity that I mentioned about just being in a context and reacting in a spontaneous way to the situation, and that kind of leisure activity of cottage life that this one I think represents so nicely because, again, like I said, that was a big part of where the energy came, both from me, I would say, and my subjects as well, in terms of relaxing and just getting the kind of images that I found intriguing, which had to do with, again, people being themselves, relaxed and spontaneous, and not visually defensive, maybe is a good way to put it. And that came from, that might probably be a big reason why I photographed the same people consistently over years and years and years. Not just because they were handy and available, because they were a part of my life, but also because over time, they got so used to the camera that the responses and the images I ended up getting, I think, started evolving because the subjects themselves were more familiar with me and what I was doing, and it changed their behavior in front of the camera, I think, to the good. And it gave me, I would say, images that just had more. Again, more of whatever it is that makes people want to look at a photograph over and over again, I guess. This other one right here is another example of, again, that kind of spontaneous family based image of leisure time and people just being themselves and relaxing. And again, that's a photograph again of my partner Doug, who I have to say is probably the one subject that has been consistent through my practice from the very beginning till now as being my life partner and being with me so much. And that's his sister, Eileen, and this is in their backyard. And this, I think, is, I feel, one of my more successful photographs from that time period, but also I would say it's pretty typical of the kinds of both situations and the kind of images I was interested in getting in my practice at this time. Yes, what makes a photograph interesting to look at? That's obviously personal, and everybody has their own reasons for engaging with photographic imagery and various images, obviously. For me, I would say that question, I guess, comes down to what did I determine was a successful image or a successful photograph? And again, I should distinguish the photograph from the image. They are two separate things. The image itself, again, this situation that's been recorded by photography, but it's also a photograph, which means it's, I had to make a lot of formal decisions, as all photographers do, around the framing especially, what to include, what not to include, all the formal things about photography and technical things about lighting and composition. And certainly I was trained, and I learned the history of the whole notion of Cartier-Bresson's idea of the decisive moment, those fractions of a second when a photograph is made and what ends up happening and gets frozen in time and becomes something that gets studied, which otherwise would be gone and maybe not even have any human awareness of that moment if it hadn't been frozen and framed and preserved in a photographic object. And for me, what I would consider my most successful works, or the ones that I chose to exhibit, were the ones that had the combination of the formal elements that are the tools that you get to play with to create an image, and the subject matter itself, and how all those things came together. Classic decision making about that kind of photography. Just again, as another example, there's probably about 7 or 8 shots of this situation where everything changed slightly from one second to the next, and the choice comes down to which one comprises all the elements that you find are the things that, again, with possibly not even knowing how to say it in words, but just where it all comes together and you feel that based on all those things I talk about, that it become just part of your decision-making process, that it works, and that's how you do it. The black and white photographs that I showed you earlier are from a body of work called Family Album, which was, as I mentioned earlier as well, the first body of work that I showed in the early 1980s. The photograph that I'm standing beside now is from an ongoing series that I started in 2002 called Homebodies. And that project is basically comprised of photographs that I take in my private, personal, domestic space, meaning my home. And so the parameters of that project comprise the whatever is inside that domestic space, my apartment, which includes my partner and our pets, and all the objects that we live with and consume and use on a regular basis. These photographs are largely spontaneous as well, similar to the photographs of people that are in the earlier bodies of work, in that most of these photographs are not staged. They are me responding to a moment of my own world in terms of just something that catches my eye, a play of light that happens within the space, something that the pets are doing, something that Doug is doing. Those sorts of things would ignite me to haul out the camera and to make a photograph. So the impulses are similar, but the subject matter, I would say, is much, much more restricted in that, by choice, a deliberate choice. Again, I talked earlier about the notion of comfort. Comfort has always been an important part of my agenda for my own life. I've sought a life of comfort and low stress, and this body of work, I think, shows the results of pursuing a life of low comfort, of high comfort and low stress. I like to think an intimacy to these photographs. All the formal concerns I talked about earlier are all present in these works. Again, the success of whether they communicate or not is left to the viewer to decide. And I must say also, in this particular exhibition, the photographs from this time period mainly just show objects, corners of rooms, a fern plant that's on the top of a cupboard, a bedroom scene that had some nice sunlight shining on the bed, flowers, corners of rooms, those sorts of things. There are photographs of Doug as well in there. They're not part of this particular exhibition, but they are part of this body of work. And I would say that the Homebodies project was largely a direct response to a desire to maximize my quality of life in terms of a private domestic world. As opposed to going out into the world, even though, as I mentioned before, the earlier works being of friends and family, they were still part of my personal world, but beyond the immediate private family of me and my partner. I would say this is the work that I've been concentrating on for the last 20 years, and I would say it's the latest manifestation of what have always been the same concerns I've had from the very beginning that I already mentioned. A relationship with the medium itself, what photography does in terms of transforming reality into an object, such as a photograph, and the subjects that are used, the images that are created of the subjects that are used in order to make photographic works. And success, I would say for myself, in terms of this, is recognizing how subject matter is just half of an equation that comes with also the making of the photograph, and the combination of the two in terms of a process that ends up creating something like this object on the wall. Even though the world that I'm working in now is much more modest and private than what I was doing earlier, for me, the photographs that I am creating in this context, I feel are the most resolved and the most satisfying, is that a proper way to say it, of what I've been trying to pursue for the last 35 years. And I would say that's it. That's all I have to say. There.
That was great. How do you feel?
Oh, fine, fine. I knew, and Doug and I joked about, I know once I get here and just start talking, I'm not going to have any trouble keeping words coming out of whether I'm saying anything that's worth paying attention to is a whole other thing, but I know I can just start going and going.